Yeah, we're back. We're live. This is ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. More specifically, this is Global Connections. And we're talking today with Brigadier General Dave Stilwell, U.S. Air Force retired, who spent a fair amount of time with the State Department and was well acquainted with China and Chinese culture and Chinese current events, if you will. Welcome to the show, Dave. Nice to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So the title of our show is Chinese Propaganda in the United States. And, we live in a world of disinformation. It's almost as if everything you hear could be disinformation. What makes Chinese propaganda different and maybe more threatening?
If you'd asked me that about the Soviet propaganda, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it would have been a pretty obvious question. And to foster a communist agenda, to soften people up, to get them to see things differently. But the connections between the U.S. and the PRC these days are such that it's really hard. And then you add social media to the mix, and it really is hard to distinguish between Chinese disinformation, trolls, and all the rest. So this will be a good chance today to maybe clarify what we mean when we do talk about propaganda.
Okay, well, let me ask my consultant, Alexa, just to help us with the definition. Alexa, what is propaganda?
Here's something I found on the web. According to slideplayer.com, propaganda, spreading information to help or hurt a cause, telling only the side you want people to know.
Alexa, what is propaganda?
According to Wikipedia, propaganda is communication that is primarily used to influence an audience and further an agenda, which may not be objective and may be selectively presenting facts in order to encourage a particular synthesis or perception, or using loaded language in order to produce an emotional rather than a rational response to the information that is being presented.
Dave, it's like when we try to shape up our shows and get show information, we always ask the host, what's the takeaway? And so the same with propaganda. There's always a purpose in it. For every piece of disinformation or exaggeration, there's a reason. And I'm sure that's so with Chinese propaganda, isn't it?
Absolutely. There's a couple of aspects to that. One, our society and our information environment is open and free, and therefore they have just opened a free access. They can get, the ambassador to the U.S. can get access. He can get on any TV show. He's all over Twitter and Facebook and all the rest. The opposite is not true. And so that's a key aspect of this, which makes it nefarious. And again, helps me, is why I use the word propaganda, because it's so lopsided. If we had the same access to the Chinese people that they have to ours, you wouldn't hear me talking about disinformation quite so much, because I could fight back. But right now, we all have one arm tied behind our back.
You mentioned before the show that you took a look at the propaganda that came in today from China. Can you say where you got it from and what it is?
Well, I don't know if you know about Bill Bishop, Sinocism, and others. There are a number of people who for years have been sort of collecting this thing and then promulgating. And so there's a great patriot named Jim Fidell who does that. And he's one of many sources we look at. But you do look at the propaganda to understand what's bothering them. What is it that, in my old job, it was about determining if you're being successful or not. Because if they respond to it, you're having the desired effect.
That suggests, Dave, that if you listen to the propaganda, you'll learn something about what's bothering them, and if you figure out their reason, which may be valid or not, you can figure out where they're coming from, what they're thinking. That's pretty instructive, isn't it?
Absolutely, Jay. It comes down to legitimacy for the system, which failed miserably in 1991 when the Soviet Union came apart. But the current leadership has doubled down on the whole idea of communism, this new type of governance system, and all those things. And when you challenge that, and when you make an argument where other countries get on board, for instance, identifying the fact that they backed out of their commitment to the UK to leave Hong Kong sovereign for 50 years, when you start pointing out the fact that you can't trust what they say, it starts to, you hit a nerve, and then you hear the response via the propaganda. No, by the way, you can't, when we use the word propaganda now, they understand that's a pejorative, it's a negative overtones. So they said, no, our information activities or whatever. No, it's propaganda.
Yeah. Well, you know what? One thing is all this seems to be around the notion of not telling the truth. I think we have a global pandemic of that, where truth is secondary. And in the Chinese case, there's certain things they want to ignore, they want to hide, they want to reject. I mean, I made a little list of the things that are really troubling. One is their human rights record on the Falun Gong. That's really disgusting. They don't want to talk about that. They just want to put the human rights. They want to put the Falun Gong in prison for retraining, end quote, which is euphemism. Euphemism is another way to lie, isn't it? And
Yes.
then, as you mentioned, Hong Kong, terrible. And every day goes by. I mean, in the news today was 47 people were arrested for doing things that in the U.S. would be, 100 miles away from any kind of violation of law. There would be First Amendment things, and these people are in trial. They're going to go to jail, maybe go to jail on the mainland in China. That's really also disgusting. And finally, of course, Xinjiang, which is a sort of a huge unfolding tragedy about how virtually millions of Muslims in the southwest of China are being tracked and imprisoned and retrained and beat up in every way. And I don't think the Chinese government wants to talk about those things. One thing of interest, and I want to throw this in the pot, see your response, is that on 60 Minutes 2 weeks ago, we were just talking about this in the last show or after the last show. There's human rights violations going gangbusters, and Bashar Assad is doing horrible torture on 10, 11, 12-year-old kids for no reason. I haven't done anything wrong. God knows why he does that. And, there was a move in the United Nations, I guess in the Security Council, to put those human rights violations and atrocities before the International Criminal Court, with part of the United Nations. And it was blocked. It was blocked by Russia and China, who both vetoed it. So focusing today on China, they got their own human rights problems. Why would they let that case go ahead in the International Court, International Criminal Justice proceedings, when they themselves, have done similar things? So what we have is trying to change the truth, deny the truth, hide the truth. So it's not just an affirmative statement of propaganda. It's this whole notion of disinformation, misinformation, and hiding the truth. This is really offensive. I mean, on a global scale, on a human scale, on a morality scale. And yet it seems to define what they say. Am I right?
It does. And as I said earlier, if we, the truth has many sides to it. And what they are trying to do is limit the side that you can see of that truth. We're getting dangerously close to that here in the U.S. I know we'll come back from the break on this once emotions damp down, but they live and die by this ability to control what you see and you hear. And so when they say you were all welcome last week, we're sending delegations out to Xinjiang all the time to prove there are no human rights abuses, and the Uyghurs want to go to vocational training camps. I say that's fine, but why are you then making it so difficult for the rest of us to go there? Why can't I just go there and see it? And the question is, what are you hiding? The same goes for the recent World Health Organization trip to Wuhan to understand the origins of the virus. Why did it take a year to get there? Why did they limit what they could see? And if the World Health Organization was being more forthright, you would understand that they were only shown what the Chinese wanted to see. And again, the question is, what are you hiding? There are no repercussions these days for covering up, though. And that's something, there needs to be a global demand that says, we understand your side of the story. You're going to have to let us, verify that. Distrust and verify, as Secretary Pompeo said at the Nixon Library.
Yeah, and go public and tell the world. Right. Shame them for lying. Catch them.
But too often journalists and national leaders and all that accept the Chinese explanation without question. And look, in many ways, that's okay. It's understandable because in '91, we sort of dropped our guard, right? The whole idea of propaganda went away, the sole superpower, all those things. But the point is, we're about 10 years too late in starting to fight that ideological battle. And that first thing you have to do in that is think about what you're hearing, and ask what you're not hearing and apply critical thinking to these obvious questions.
Yes, of course. But what are we hearing? I mean, on a given Monday morning, what kind of propaganda is filtering out into the United States from China, and how?
Well, how is through every pore possible. They have mastered Twitter, Facebook, and all those things. We can't get at Weibo or any of the other Chinese things without getting censored. We tried to get an op-ed published. I mean, the ambassador here publishes in New York Times, CNN, all that constantly. We tried to get the ambassador in Beijing to just do one simple op-ed explaining, U.S. policy, and they wouldn't do it. If you look at the Twitter, you'll see that we posted not just the op-ed we wanted to print, but also the Chinese rejection letter, which was actually pretty helpful because what they said was total hooey. You ask what they're saying. Here's a recent article on multilateralism. What I would say is we need to look for these buzzwords like multilateralism and new type anything and understand what they mean by it. Multilateralism means the Chinese owns 4 leadership positions of 15 in the UN. There are 200 countries opted for those leadership positions, and China holds 4 of them. That's multilateralism, and that's why the WHO is not led by the Chinese. It was in the previous iteration, but it's being basically influenced and controlled by it. World Bank has issues. I can name a bunch of ideas. That you asked what's in the news today. That's one. Xinjiang is always in the news. South China Sea, UK, Germany, Britain. Britain. 6 countries total. Canada have all committed to do patrols in the South China Sea in the near future. They're talking about that. Why are you militarizing South China Sea? I don't know. What are those islands over there that you just built?
So if I said to them, why are you doing this? What you're lying, you're giving us disinformation, you're feeding it into global communications. It's not true. It's not helpful. It's destructive at the end of the day. Why are you doing this? What's the purpose of your campaign?
Well, I think it's look. The number one priority is survival. I mean, the legitimacy of the system is in question. Even given all the stuff that's happened here in the U.S. in the last 2 months, no one doubts the legitimacy of democracy. But new authoritarianism, there's big questions about these. Is it valid or not? So they do have to control the narrative. You tracking this new software called Clubhouse?
I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it.
It's an app like Twitter and others, but it's not typed. It's all voice, and basically does everything you can to anonymize all the participants. So now you can speak your mind without worry about the MSS knocking on the door while you're talking, which happened a lot during the Wuhan opening of the pandemic. Chinese, flocked to Clubhouse. They could actually criticize the government and say the things they've wanted to say for years, and then it got shut down. If you had an open information environment in the PRC, what you would hear from the people is, we don't like this system that's oppressive. Yes, we like the economic growth and all the rest, but if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I mean, the very basic needs is just self-actualization and the ability to express yourself and be yourself. And this new type of governance doesn't allow for that. It can't.
Well, if I went to the average Chinese, and the average Chinese he's gone through school. He probably has a college degree. Very likely he has more than that. And although he may not have a course in critical thinking or current events, he probably has a course that will help him do critical thinking. I mean, engineering, for example. If I go through an engineering program, and like 60% of college graduates in China go through an engineering program, I should have the acuity to do critical thinking. So what does the average Chinese think about this? Is he applying critical, or she applying critical thinking? Is he saying, wait a minute, this is propaganda, they're just trying to twist me on this? Or does he not know? Does he simply accept?
5-10 years ago, I would have said things were actually looking better in that regard. They have successfully, the Communist Party has successfully employed nationalism and emotion to have people suspend disbelief and believe what they're seeing on CGTN, CCTV in China and others. So that's a very troubling trend also. But in the end, truth has a resonance of its own. People understand when they're hearing all sides of a story. A very wise person, 2,000 years ago said, "What is truth?" I wrestled with that for years, but I get it now. Truth has many facets, and as we see in our own social media sphere, truth is divergent. right? Because people don't want to hear parts of the argument that don't agree with their worldview. So we've got to work out some stuff domestically. We have to, I think if we can talk more about critical thinking here in the US and teach it like we did during the Cold War, social media would be less of a problem. It would be less divergent because people would hear something that's just too horrible to be true and then ask themselves, what am I missing here? Maybe I should go find out more about this. The Chinese people are the same way, but less and less so as this contest heats up and the government fans the flames of nationalism. We know where that ends.
Yeah, and well, the other part of it is, if you want to restate your concern, your critical thinking in public, you run a risk. You run a risk on having your acceptance score reduced. You can't ride the train, can't get a good job, you lose your job. All these things happen to you. So you really have to be quiet about it. You can have critical thinking, but don't say a word. I mean, this is a real problem. Therefore, the clubhouse phenomenon. This is a real problem because critical thinking in a vacuum, it's personal only, and it doesn't affect the politics that the propaganda was intended to affect in the first place.
Here's the downside of this. You say when you can control the entire media environment and sell your people this line of propaganda that prevents them from questioning your rationale or existence. The other half of that, though, is it absolutely squashes creative thinking, critical thinking and creative thinking. And so people, look, the Chinese are just as creative as any culture on the planet. These are the guys who brought you May 35th, which is June 4th, but you couldn't say June 4th because you would get harmonized if you type that. So you talk about May 35th, you talk about Winnie the Pooh, you talk about all these euphemisms or code words that are, and they're dodging the censors as really well. It's fun to watch just how creative these people can be. But creative thinking is a risk. It's dangerous because it leads you to ask questions like, why is the Communist Party the only party that can run China? Taiwan runs just fine with a democratic government. So why not China?
Yeah. Well, okay, so the propaganda comes into the United States and it comes in many forms. And I wondered, does it have an effect here? Are people using critical thinking to question it and reject it if appropriate? How concerned should we be with the threat of, the insinuation of propaganda into our public conversation?
So on all these is just a small number of the ones that came out today, but the term decoupling, that's a Chinese term that's been fed into our lexicon to give you this idea that this, U.S. is going to kill our own economy as well as the Chinese if we actually protect ourselves in the trade sphere. We're getting fleeced, and there's no balance in this relationship. And yet, if we try to protect ourselves, that's decoupling. So it's having an effect because people are now looking at what happened in the past and what the President Biden is committed to is to continue to defend our own trade interests by insisting we get a fair shake, which is what the WTO defines, and yet that doesn't work either. So I say disentangle. Our two economies have become two root balls that have gotten too close together, and the roots are all tangled up, which serves China's purposes just great, but not our own. We just need to disentangle these root balls so we engage on a discrete fashion. Competition versus cooperation. The Chinese will say, "Oh, you're now wanting to compete. You call us a strategic competitor." They call us the enemy. They've always called us the enemy, at least since 1950 and the Korean War. So, but they're saying, "Oh, you guys shouldn't use the word compete because you're turning it. If you treat China like an enemy, they'll be an enemy." We've been cooperating all this time, and they've been competing, which we're helping them score goals on us. That doesn't help anybody. Opening up every time someone complains about the closed nature of the Chinese economy and wants more access in the same way they get it here in the U.S. The Chinese, I can show you 20 right now where President Xi Jinping has said, we understand we will continue to reform and open up our markets while doing the opposite. So American people who don't track the stuff hear that and they go, well, yeah, they're trying, right? No, they're doing the opposite. So I could give you 100 examples like this. I could post them if you want, stuff for people to read of classic disinformation.
So if I'm, the target of this kind of propaganda, and it could be coming not necessarily from China, it could be coming from some other vector, right? Second degree vector. the degree of sanguinity that I don't even know. And here it is being shot at me. Is there a response? Is there somebody I can go to, some source that says, wait a minute, let's get this straight? You know, we can tell you what's really going on. We can critique the propaganda. We can tell you where it's coming from, why, and all that. Where do I go?
You go to America's most trusted network. I'm kidding. Where's Walter Cronkite when you need him? Here's the problem.
Yeah,
People look at
right.
the news and you pick an outlet. they're all screwed up. Media, news, traditional media has become business. It always was business, but it's become cynical business that sells it's about readership, it's about clickbait, it's about all those things. Until the American media and Western media gets serious, NHK is generally really good. BBC is mostly good, but even The Economist, which I subscribed to for years, has just gone south. They did not like the choice of the American people between 2017 and 2021. It was plainly obvious. And they, like a lot of others, decided they were going to do their part to undermine it. So you have to, I think, just have to read widely. And you can't have somebody aggregate for you because they're going to be selling a line. And so you have to look at sources you trust and sources you don't like hearing from because they have their story too.
It's hard, you know, critical thinking is hard. It's like you really have to work at it because you have to clean your own mind out of what's not true. And you have to watch out in the sense that anything could be untrue. You don't know. It's problematic. But let me ask you, can you distinguish between what has happened, what is happening with China and its attempt to affect our public conversation, and Russia, who seems to me, at least in the public view of it anyway, has been much more draconian in trying to affect our politics and trying to affect our elections? This is very troubling. Are they talking out of the same playbook, or is it a different playbook? And which one should we be more concerned about in terms of, preserving our democracy?
I think focusing too much, 40 years ago, you could have focused on a single adversary and come up with an answer to that. I think today we've seen the enemy and it is us, because it's not just what the Chinese are doing. I don't personally think the Chinese cared who won the election. All they cared about was the hate and discontent that came out of the process. I mean, this is where trolls come in, right? You assault somebody. You asked about critical thinking being difficult. It can be fun. And if it's taught the right way,
Critical thinking can be fun. I love it.
It can be. You look for things. There's one of the 15 logical flaws. U.S. is in relative decline. A guy named Graham Allison out of Harvard jumped on this, and he called this the Thucydides trap. U.S. is in decline. China's the rising power. Therefore, we should back off and give China what it wants. I mean, I personally don't like his logic, but you know where that language about China or the U.S. in decline came from? Came from the Zhongxuanbu, the Central Propaganda Ministry in the PRC. You know where the first mention of U.S. badly botching the handling of the coronavirus came from? It came from MFA spokesman Zhao Lijian on the 2nd of March. On the 3rd of February, a month prior to that, he wasn't saying that we badly botched the response. He was responding to our closure of our borders to the Chinese, and he said, the U.S. is overreacting. You're overreacting to the outbreak of the virus. We have it under control here in China. You're doing it because you don't like Chinese. A month later, he totally flip-flops. And he says, you've completely botched the handling of it. We closed our borders. We did all the things that, in fact, is you cannot handle a pandemic. You can only mitigate the impact. All that being said is, I would suggest that's a false premise, by the way, right? The U.S. is in decline. Prove that. Show that. Let's look at relative GDP and all the rest. So use critical thinking
a lot of
tools.
people in this country believe that in so many words.
You say it, you tell a lie often enough, people will believe it.
So what about Russia? I mean, I see Russia as actually more malicious in the sense that they not only want to spread things that are not true, but they want to affect our elections. They want to create dissension and divisiveness among our people, and they have. I mean, I look at this, and I'm no expert, but I look at this and I say, gee whiz, there's so many things that happen that could it's like climate change. There's so many things that happen that could be directly a result of climate change. Nobody wants to talk about it, but there it is. Likewise, there are so many things that happen. It could be the direct result of people in Moscow, in the what do you call it, Internet Research Agency, right, in Moscow, whose job it is to try to divide us. And I think the classic was right after Trump was elected. There were two competing protest demonstrations in Manhattan. One was pro-Trump, the other was anti-Trump. Both of them were organized by social media coming out of the IRA in Moscow. This is very troubling, and if you know that, then you wonder about everything that happened afterward. My question is, what's the difference? Do we know the difference between, Russian propaganda and attempts? It seems to me that Russian propaganda is more than just propaganda. They affirmatively attempt to damage us. I think the message was clear about the hacking last summer, a couple 3 months ago, where it came from Russia, and they're hacking into our election, 2 national elections, and God knows how many state elections they have affirmatively affected, not tried, but succeeded in affecting. That's, to me, that's more threatening. And that seems to be, the general understanding of what they've been doing. So query, what's worse?
They're all bad. Like I said, I think the Russians pioneered this. They're the ones that figured it out first, but the PRC was right on their heels. I'm pretty sure that they're talking to each other and sharing techniques and the like. If you remember back in 2011 or 12, we had APT1 was a Mandiant report. It's worth reading that one because this was like the very first realization by the US that China was up to no good on the internet. Other than that, I can't really speak much to the difference in their systems other than our system, and not just ours, any democratic system is a direct threat to their style of leadership, and they have to do things to discredit it. So back to critical thinking, it's not just them. Iran's doing it. Everybody's doing it. It's in the old days, warfare was the domain of kings because nobody could afford to put up that much stuff or buy tanks or nuclear weapons. Warfare is the domain of that. This is warfare. An internet connection, and a laptop. You're a key player. You can take down electric grids. You can undo elections and all that stuff. It's a new world. We got to wake up to it.
The new world. I mean, and the two things. One is disinformation, and the other is taking down grids and the like. They're kind of related in a funny way. But I think what troubles me and what troubles a lot of people is what's happened in this country, where the president can get up and make a lie, and he can do it over and over and over again. After a while, people, because he has the bully pulpit, people will agree. And in fact, 70 million people did agree and do agree right now today, even though we know objectively that's not true. And then you have the people in QAnon who affirmatively believe in this conspiracy theory. And now, most recently, the people who deny that January 6th ever happened. It really wasn't the Trump constituency. It was somebody else, and that's not true either. So what you have is a growing, overwhelming notion that there is no truth, that you can't rely on anything. And this is troubling in a democracy because, you distinguish a democracy from a dictatorship. The one distinguishing point is a democracy requires truth. You have to have truth from the government, truth among the people. Without that, how can you have an intelligent electorate that can do their part in maintaining the democracy? And I feel that you talk about propaganda in China, and to a different degree coming out of Russia, but we have propaganda coming out of this country, not only from people in government like Trump, but from a lot of people who get on that same bandwagon and who are spreading, using social media, retweeting and the like, untrue statements. So we're living in a world, a sea of untruth here.
Jay, I'll get voted off the island for this comment, but I want to say there's two sides to every story. Let me just give you one. Officer Sicknick was killed in the Capitol building on 6th January, right? New York Times printed that a Trump supporter hit him in the head with a fire extinguisher and killed him. Every bit of that is false. There is nothing about that was true. And they published a rebuttal. but it was hidden in the back and it was never brought to light. And so, remember the word spin when it first came out back in the 90s in the Clinton era? We're not going to lie, but we're going to tell the story in a way. Nothing is new under the sun. In the last 4 years, I know they were emotional, and I know they were divisive in many ways. I wouldn't write off 70 million or 75 million Americans. They have their story too. They voted. I don't think you can discount them as all being what's the word, fooled or whatever. But see, this is a conversation we have to have without people getting emotional or angry. This is two sides of the truth. Not everything in the last 4 years was bad. There was plenty of bad, but I can point back to other administrations where there was bad too. We talk about degrees. We can talk about all that stuff, and I'd love to have that conversation.
Well, what I worry about is that propaganda can come from any direction.
Yep.
It can come from China. It can come from Russia. It can come from Madison Avenue. I mean, just watch some of those commercials on television. We spend enough, about half the time we spend watching the news, such as it is, and the other half the time we spend watching Madison Avenue. Is Madison Avenue telling us the truth? They're creating this kind of fictitious world of invidious comparison. Yes, you can have a fancy car and a yacht, and you should buy all these products because they're the things that will save your life. And I'm saying to myself, is that true? So critical thinking has to apply across the board,
Yep.
and query whether we are awash in challenges, okay, in critical thinking. And so I don't know where it goes, except I think that what I come out of this with is, yes, China is intentionally, willfully, for its own national purposes, and its priorities, its pragmatic priorities, lying to us and insinuating lies into our public conversation. And so is Russia. And we don't see it, but we also do it to ourselves. I think we are living in a world where, critical thinking is very hard. And if I spot something, goes back to my question to you about what happens if the Chinese citizen spots something. If I spot something and I don't think it's true, what do I do about that? And can I affect, 300 million people the way they think? Or are we all going to have our own separate levels of truth? And can we conduct a democracy that way? We are the bastion of democracy for the world. What do we need to do to clear the air about propaganda in China, Russia, and ourselves?
Well, first off, half the problem is recognizing there is a problem. And like I tell, friends at church and other places who don't share my opinions, and in many ways question my sanity for, heading back to DC for 20 months. Let's have the conversation, and let's respect each other's own perspectives enough to listen to them and hear them out and hear them. Don't just listen to them thinking of your counter argument. Hear what they're having to say and try to understand why they think that way. So again, I think all of this ends up. You said things are bad. They've been bad. They're really bad now. This actually is going to drive us to a point where we're going to have to decide, and we're going to have to take a serious look at how information is moved in this country, and get serious about it. And then all the things you described earlier will then become to unravel and solve themselves when we get to a basis where we take thinking about thinking more seriously, which is critical thinking. Think about why you feel the way you do. Why do you favor that story over that story? And if we can do that, and if you know anybody at the Department of Education here in Hawaii, because the federal government does not drive curriculum, states do. I would really like to hear a conversation about how you start introducing that critical thinking curriculum at the earliest ages. And to wait until college is too late. You got to start thinking about that when you're young.
I totally agree. And right now, I don't see any movement in that direction to try to make that a uniform priority around the country. But one thing, Dave, we should continue this conversation. We should continue looking and seeing what is coming into our mainstream thought, our individual thought, and try to figure out how to bring Humpty back together again.
And we start here locally, and then like with cultural diversity, Hawaii, I think, is the model for that. I would love to export the Hawaiian model back to the mainland. That would be a really good start.
Let's do it again, Dave.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Dave Stilwell, Lieutenant General, U.S. Air Force, retired. Appreciate your thoughts. Thanks. Aloha.